Hey there, I'm so glad to be here today to talk with you all about ransomware. My name is Erick, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer of Vynyl, a product development company with clients primarily in healthcare, fintech, and insurance. Let's just say we're really comfortable in highly regulated spaces. In addition to building and operating software and platforms, we advise our clients on security, compliance, product management, innovation, and process improvement. We're proud to be based in Boise, and we love being part of this great community and this great event every year. I'm going to do my best to tell you why you should personally care about ransomware, the basics of what ransomware is, and the things I think we can expect to happen over the next few years to a decade. I'm also going to connect some of the dots so that when you read or hear about a new ransomware attack in the press, you'll have a deeper appreciation for all the implications. Let me set the stage with a quick story. So there's a running joke in the information security community that if you talk about any piece of malware, and malware is the generic term for any piece of software created for malicious purposes, somebody will jump into the conversation to say it's built on top of or inspired by Stuxnet. So for anybody who doesn't know, Stuxnet was, in my view, really the first celebrity malware. It was software deployed with the specific purpose of doing physical damage to the gas centrifuges at Iran's uranium enrichment facilities. And it was a landmark because it was multi-stage malware, and it was run as a military campaign. It had several distinct components it was built up from, and they stacked them one on top of another over time. They tested them. They tested each and every one individually to make sure that when it was time to actually pull the trigger, as it were, everything was going to work. So what I want you to take away from this is that malware is a game of mix and match now. And the high bar of a previous campaign is now the low bar of any new campaign. The people who are building the malware are learning from past experiences, their own and others. They're sharing experiences. And so the threat is becoming more pervasive and more sophisticated over time. The other thing I want you to take away is that malware campaigns in 2021 are really group sports. The places where these groups hail from, which we'll get into in a little bit, they are not so good about enforcing the law, international or local law. So Stuxnet was a cyber weapon that was deployed with a specific political goal and a specific military target. Prior to the era of malware, those gas centrifuges might have been bombed. They might have been sabotaged. They might have started a war. You know, it's a pretty serious thing to think that somebody is developing the capabilities to build nuclear weapons. I would say that modern ransomware really can only exist because of the adoption of military tools. In fact, modern ransomware can only exist because of encryption, which absolutely was developed as a military tool for World War II. And it's not only used to take the data ransom, to take the data hostage so that you can get a ransom, it's also used to power Bitcoin, which is what the ransom takers are being paid in, almost exclusively. So this interesting juxtaposition of tactics, techniques, and technologies is also where the title of this talk comes from. The War of the Flea is the title of a terrific book that studies the history of guerrilla warfare. And in that book, the author says, the guerrilla fights the war of the flea, and his enemy suffers the dog's disadvantage. Too much to defend, too small, ubiquitous, and agile an enemy to come to grips with. And this is very apropos, right? It's an instructive lens to view ransomware through. If you're sitting in your metaphorical castle, which in this case is your organization's computer network, and your adversary can inflict a ton of damage using cobbled together, readily available tools, then you have a problem. And if there's a whole swarm of adversaries looking to take a bite, well, that makes you the dog, getting gobbled up by the fleas, each one taking only a little, causing only a little damage in the grand scheme of things. But in the aggregate, the fleas are an existential issue. You need a flea collar, maybe some flea powder or a flea bath, something, because otherwise it's just bite after bite, and that is no way to live. And make no mistake, we are living in the century of the flea. It's only going to get cheaper and easier to deploy ransomware campaigns, while our networks and computer services are going to continue multiplying and increasing in complexity and fragility. We'd also be well served to remember that ransomware might not always just cause monetary damage. Some collaboration happens because secrets are stolen. Some of it happens because the nation states have an interest in making the criminal gangs more effective. And some of it happens the other way because the criminal gangs get arrested and their software gets seized. But whether or not the collaboration is intentional, this collaboration amongst the criminals and the nation states brings us to a world where malicious computer software has now tragically been blamed even for the death of a child. On July 16, 2019, a woman arrived at the Spring Hill Medical Center to have her baby. By the time she arrived, the hospital's computers had been disabled by a ransomware attack, since I'm telling you about it in this talk. They'd been disabled for over a week. There was no access to patient records on the computer. There was no access to the real-time staff tracker, no access to the system that allowed remote monitoring of fetal heartbeats in the delivery rooms. In fact, doctors and nurses were communicating with each other by text message. The little girl was born with her umbilical cord wrapped around her neck. If all the computers had been working normally, this would almost certainly have triggered a warning on the heart monitor. At least in part because the doctors and nurses didn't get that warning, the little girl was born with severe brain damage. She died 9 months later. So most of these facts are not in dispute in the ongoing lawsuit. The attending obstetrician said in a text message to the nurse manager that she would have delivered the baby by cesarean if she had seen or been alerted to the monitor readings. She said in a text message, this was preventable. The hospital itself, of course, disputes that the death was caused by any negligence on their part, and only time will tell if the case actually ends up at trial. Either way, it was a tragic outcome. So I wanted to tell you those stories to underscore the evolving nature of the threat, and perhaps more importantly, the fact that each and every one of you either already has been or soon will be impacted by ransomware. When that time comes, I hope the impact is innocuous, that it's only leaked data or a slowdown of services or higher prices that you're impacted with, and not anything like the tragedy that befell that little girl and her family. The original title of this talk was, if you're reading this, it's already too late. I thought that was apt because the truth is that most people's experience of ransomware is that they don't know they've been hit until they're actually seeing a screen that says, all your files are encrypted, send Bitcoin or else, which is not a great day for anyone. So every strain of ransomware is different, but at the end of the day, they all have to do 6 things. They have to get onto your network. They have to infect one or more of the computers on your network. They have to get a toehold, so to speak. They have to slither around ever so stealthily, because if you catch them, you can kill them early. But they have to get through your network and persist themselves so they can stay active while they do the really bad stuff. Once all that's accomplished, they have to look around and see what data is available for stealing and or encrypting, and they need to actually do the encryption. Finally, of course, they have to send you a delightful note telling you that if you want your data back, you're going to need to send them some Bitcoin. So step 1, they have to get a program onto your computer. Now, it turns out that well over half the instances of ransomware deliver this dropper program. That's the initial program that kicks off the attack. That well over half of those are distributed via phishing attacks, pretextual emails, pretextual text messages, that type of thing that I'm sure you all get training for at your companies or your schools. That's not really surprising. Research and practical experience show us over and over that people will click on anything. That's why, in addition to spending tons of money on security awareness training, more and more companies are putting technical mitigations in place to make this first step harder. Because ransomware is now a business model, this increased investment by defenders has spawned an entirely new set of players called initial access brokers. And this is the theme, right? As the defenders respond, the attackers respond. And the attackers are responding very quickly these days, and the defenders are responding about the same speed they always have, which is pretty slow, unfortunately. So these initial access brokers basically only sell one thing, and they get paid very well for it. The thing they sell is a way onto your company's network, onto your organization's computers. They run phishing campaigns themselves, of course. They also will try to subvert employees by paying them or compromising them to, quote unquote, leave the door unlocked. They exploit known vulnerabilities and unknown vulnerabilities if they can get their hands on those or create them themselves to get into your network. At the end of the day, they find a way in and they save it away. They put it in their little malware safe and they wait for a buyer. Typically, the buyer is a ransomware operator, right? And let's be honest, when I say operator, what I mean is criminal gang, because that's what we're really talking about here. The next step after that is the dropper program runs. This program calls back to the mothership and it downloads the really nasty stuff. This phase of the program, the infiltration phase, creeps and crawls around your network. It gets good and wedged into all the nooks and crannies so it can see all of your data. So it can decide what it needs to encrypt, what it wants to encrypt, right? During this phase, it also generates a unique key for your specific network, for the specific attack, because the promise is that if you pay the ransom, they will supply you with the secret key that is solely able to decrypt your data. That's what they say, and it's true often enough that many organizations still are paying up. So the next step is they target you. They target the files they're going to be held hostage. This step can take some time. It doesn't happen in 30 minutes or an hour. It can take days, weeks, sometimes months before it triggers as they root around all of your systems and try and gain increasing levels of access. Another more recent innovation is that we're seeing more human remote steering instead of the program just running on its own without human supervision. So the humans are actually getting involved and pointing at certain types of systems to do reconnaissance. Finally, it's time. They pull the trigger, the encryption starts. And the interesting thing about this phase is that this is where many security staffs first learn they've been infected by ransomware, because almost all companies have some kind of software running that sees mass changes to files like encryption and flags that activity as possibly malicious. So there are, of course, companies that have their security really buttoned up. They discover it much earlier. They never get to this phase because they kicked the malware out long before the encryption ever started. But that's definitely not the majority, right? Most companies discover they have ransomware when their files start to get encrypted. And at that point, it really is already too late. Finally, a ransom note is delivered. They often are even super helpful and tell you how you can pay them, right? Because not every company has Bitcoins laying around in order to pay ransom. Although, fun fact, lots of companies are investing in a certain number of Bitcoins on the bet that they're only going to become more expensive in US dollars over time, so that if they need to pay Bitcoin ransom, they will have cheaper Bitcoins to pay. So that's how ransomware works at a high level. There's a lot of details we're not going to get into. If you're in the Slack now, I'm here too. So please feel free to ask away. I'd love to talk to you about it. Next, I'm going to talk about how ransomware has evolved over time. So the first ransomware arguably was in 1989, and it was distributed on floppy disks, if any of you listening remember those. The fellow who distributed them was an actual biology researcher. He worked at a university. And I think he was trying to charge people $169 so that he would provide them with the code to decrypt their file names. He didn't even encrypt the file system. He just scrambled the file name entries in a reversible way. And the kicker to that story is that at the time, none of this stuff was even illegal. The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act didn't exist. None of the cybersecurity framework or laws existed. It was a much, much earlier time. And so he didn't even get in legal trouble. He just made some people mad. Now, roll camera forward to the 2000s, and you live in a completely different world. Floppy disks are falling out of favor because the computers are connected to this global internet, right? Thousands and thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of computers are connected to this globe-spanning computer network. And this network was created by people whose base assumption was that everyone would behave themselves. And that base assumption made it actually pretty trivial to automate the spreading of malware, which is where botnets came from. Botnets are exactly what they sound like. They are robots in a network that exist for the sole purpose of replicating themselves, or that's what they existed for when they were created. At some point, though, the people who created these botnets, who controlled the botnets, they realized they could maybe use them to make some money instead of just self-replicating. And so the programs got a little more sophisticated every year, and at some point, encryption came into it in lots of different aspects, but particularly in the way we know it today with ransomware. and they started to actually grab people's data and encrypt it. This was still, small potatoes for the longest time, well over a decade, for lots of reasons, which we're going to talk about a little bit. And it continued that way until around 2017. 2017, to my mind, marked a phase shift. We weren't any longer dealing with individual hackers in a basement or in a university computer lab. We were dealing with organized criminal activity, with organized criminal rings who were looking to make serious money. So I'm not going to drown you in numbers, but I want to show why I think 2017 was the inflection point. In 2016 and years prior, there were a lot of attacks. This is a graph of the attacks in millions, and there were lots. That's because the robots were just roaming around the internet attacking everybody, just knocking on every door. If they got in, then they would do whatever it was they were sent there to do, if they weren't rooted out by antivirus or something. And they weren't super sophisticated for the most part. Although, again, each year they were getting more sophisticated. But then something changed. And I think what changed is these criminal gangs started paying attention. Because in 2017, the number of attacks went down drastically. And that's not because people were less interested in breaking into computers. It's because the humans put their hands on the steering wheel and they started picking their targets instead of just letting the robots roam the internet. As you can see, 2017, 2018, 2019, mostly steady. I think this shows that they spent those 3 years really figuring stuff out and figuring out how to pick good targets, good, soft, fat targets. Also by 2017, there was a marketplace for buying and selling ransomware and pieces of ransomware. What happened starting around then and what continues today is the mass collaboration between states and criminal gangs for the purpose of financial gain. This is big money and it's big volume. And they clearly figured it out because in 2020, it really ticked up hard, as you can see from the money, right? In this chart, there was not big money in 2015, 16, 17, 18. Even in 2019, it wasn't super big money, essentially $500,000 per occurrence. In 2020, on the basis of the 304 million attacks we saw in the previous slide, they got $406.3 million out of all this. That's about $1.5 million per occurrence. And that trend appears to be continuing in 2021. So the final piece of my story, and a big reason I draw the conclusions I draw, is that you can see the breakdown in the different kinds of malware. Ryuk was essentially non-existent until 2019 and 2020, but it went from not much to the lion's share in very short time. I love that they call it revenue on this slide, but I guess if your business is criminal extortion, these ransom payments are your revenue. So Ryuk was not prevalent at all in 2018, was very prevalent in 2019, it was dominant in 2020. It's a very short amount of time to make that magnitude of change. And Sodinokibi, which is also called Revel, for anybody who has been following along with the various strains of ransomware, is following that same path. Very small in 19, much bigger in 20, and already much, much bigger this year. It's also interesting where these things are coming from and who they're being sponsored by. Russia's very well represented. I mean, there's also Iran and Ukraine, of course, but we're really talking about Russia. You can see from the flags at the bottom on the legend. I put flags on top of the names. You'll also notice that China is not represented here. And that might be surprising since we know that they are a cyber power, perhaps the second most sophisticated after the United States. And who knows if that might switch someday. Until very recently, though, China hasn't gotten into the criminal extortion side of this game in any huge way. They use very similar techniques, but their goals are primarily espionage, not getting money. So they're not really covered here. We do have reason to believe that that's changing, that they are sharing code with criminal gangs and vice versa. And I will not be surprised at all if we recap this near the end of 2022 and this slide looks very different. So to round out this piece of the talk, I'm going to address the evolving business model being used by these criminal gangs. The way it works is that the ransomware developers who actually make the software don't, as a rule, run the compromise operations that get the software onto victims' networks. They have what they call affiliates. It's crazy, like they're Herbalife affiliates or something. And the affiliates get the software onto the victim networks, just as we discussed earlier. But the victims, the ones that pay up, they pay directly back to the developers. The developers pay the affiliates a commission, all very civilized and really frightening in its efficiency. So for those of you who have been fortunate enough not to have seen one of these in the wild, this is what you end up with. This is the WannaCry description screen. And it tells you exactly what happened, exactly how much time you have left before your data is deleted forever. There's literally a ticking clock. And it tells you how to go and get your Bitcoin if you need to buy it in order to pay the ransom. And then it tells you where to send it. You can see from the amount on this slide that this is from a simpler time, probably late 2016, maybe a little earlier in the year in 2016. $300 worth of Bitcoin and you're on your way. Today, that price tag, of course, would be much, much higher. So when you look at all this together, when I look at all this together at least, I feel like 2020 was really the start of something new. And the reasons I feel that way are, first off, nation states appear to be getting more involved. There's no question that the Russian FSB is a sponsor of several of these criminal gangs. In fact, the people running these various enterprises are targeting our companies' organizations here in the US. They could very well be intelligence officers. Russian military intelligence has similarly been attributed with leadership of some of these gangs. The second thing is the criminal gangs themselves are working together. Like they have Slack, or maybe Microsoft Teams. Maybe they're doing it all on Signal. I don't know. But they get together and they talk about the best ways to deploy ransomware. It's like simultaneously terrifying and incredibly banal to my mind. Because I think about the Slack groups I'm a part of, and we talk about, important stuff, sure, but then we post a meme and everybody laughs and we talk about what we're going to do on the weekend. And I imagine these criminals are doing the same thing. They're not hunkered down in a cave or a burnout office building somewhere. They're just sitting in an internet cafe talking about how they're going to get millions of dollars from corporations in the US, Canada, and Europe for the most part. And along with that, ransomware is a commodity now. You really can just go to the ransomware app store and buy some ransomware. There are all sorts of new attack vectors. Our homes are smart now. My stove wants to be on the internet. It's never going to be, but it wants to be. It asks me about it every so often. And all sorts of other things want to be connected to the internet. Some of them have to be connected to the internet in order to work. Light bulbs are connected to the internet. I will never have one of those in my house. You shouldn't either. Or a Ring camera, but don't get me started. But they all want to be on the internet, and who knows what kind of security measures have been taken to keep malware from getting onto those devices. They're just little computers. It's not like they're exempt because they're tiny. So new attack vectors. Humans are guiding the attacks. This is very important. And it's important because to date, knock on wood, the computers have not replaced the humans as far as creativity goes. And so the fact that they're remotely guiding these attacks without exposing themselves is a big, big deal. And finally, they've started doing what's called expanded extortion. So the expanded extortion model is ingenious in an evil sort of way. You have to admire their creativity, I guess. What they basically do is they double extort you. They encrypt your files, but they also steal them. And they tell you, if you don't pay, not only are we deleting your files, not going to give you the encryption to, unlock them, we're not going to give that back to you, but we're also going to publish them on the internet. They're going to share the information with the world. And, sometimes they share it in a targeted way. They don't just dump it. They pick out stuff that they think will be potentially embarrassing to your organization or to the officers of the organization. From there, they've gone on to what I call triple extortion. There's not broad accepted terminology for this stuff. But I think of triple extortion as this super exciting innovation where they also go through the data, particularly emails, messaging, that kind of thing, and they target your people, the individual employees, not just the officers of the corporation who might have made an embarrassing decision, but two coworkers who might have sent some emails that they should not have. And they tell them, hey, you person, you individual employee, if you don't get your employer to pay, I'm going to release your data. I'm going to attribute it to your name. I'm going to tell your friends and family what you wrote. So get to it. Go tell your company to pay up. And then there's even quadruple extortion, which is where they reach through to your stakeholders, your customers and clients, and any communications you've had with them. They also tell the clients and customers that they're going to be embarrassed if they don't encourage you to pay up. And often, by the way, just like criminal enterprises throughout history, they tell each of the people that are being extorted that they're all responsible for 100% of the ransom. And so, fortunately, this doesn't happen very often, but in the best case, I guess they could get paid their ransom 4 times over. So that's all terrible and bad, of course, but where does that leave us? So I think the only long-term solution is for companies to actually have better security posture. And that's unfortunate because I would say that while some companies know how to do that, most don't. And we, as a society, as a polity, we don't know how to do that. We undervalue security, we underinvest in security, and the security that we do deploy oftentimes is either neutral or harmful to the actual security posture of these companies. Also, all the research to date is very clear that markets don't punish companies that have breaches. A couple of different studies spring to mind. One is the study about what happens to companies who have their trade secrets leaked. It turns out nothing happens to them on the whole. And individually even, the effects are negligible or non-existent. And when I say effects, I'm talking about effects to their stock price. Financial effects, right? The company's valuation. It simply doesn't harm them. And ditto for companies that suffer data breaches of some kind. They're simply not harmed in the marketplace. So a logical extension of that, I think, is that there are millions of soft targets in the world. These companies who have been trained not to care that much about security because they suffer no ill consequences for having poor security. They're soft in the sense they can pay, they're underinvested in cybersecurity, or they're overinvested in the wrong kinds of cybersecurity. And so I think things have got to change. And I'm going to talk about what comes next in a minute. But things are going to change because we have a public interest in getting rid not only of ransomware, but all other kinds of cyber activity using the same kinds of techniques. And again, this goes back to the war of the flea, right? When there are so many fleas that all of your blood is sucked out, you simply die. And we're going to get there. It's going to happen. And you can't count on a conservatory mindset in the criminal gangs, right? You can't count on them to only drink as much blood as they think you can bear to lose. And so that's why I say this has to change. But there are many millions of soft targets in the world, like I said. And so even if 10% a year become invulnerable, take themselves off the list of soft targets, then they are still going to leave the 90%. And so we're going to be playing whack-a-mole with this for well over a decade, right? And the final thing that I'll point out here is cyber insurance. I'm often asked about cyber insurance and its effect on security and security posture. And it turns out that cyber insurance is not super helpful as far as stopping these attacks. Actually, cyber insurance is not super helpful in making companies more secure at all, because it turns out that everybody is only interested in the cheapest solution, most of all the insurance companies. And so the alternative to paying the ransom is oftentimes much more expensive. Right? You have to take the entire network offline, shut down the computers, find the backups, restore the backups, right? Comb through the computers and make sure nothing nasty has been left behind besides the encryption, the code that encrypted the data, right? Make sure you've kicked out the bad people. And it can take weeks or it can take months. In certain large organizations, it could take years. And all during that time, the insurance company is going to be paying some amount of money, which is almost certainly going to be greater than the $1 million or $2 million or even $5 million they pay out so that the ransom can be paid by the company. So perverse incentives, right? I'll caveat this by saying this is my opinion. I'm not alone in most of this, but still, it's definitely a take it for what it's worth kind of situation. I think there's going to be an increase in sanctions and regulatory activity. That's a pretty easy prediction. We've seen it already. If you've been following the news, a cryptocurrency exchange was just sanctioned by OFAC, the Office of Foreign Currency. You can't send that exchange money anymore because they were taking money from the bad guys. Simplified, it boils down to they thought they were part of this criminal enterprise. And so now they're sanctioned. And sending money to them is roughly the same thing as sending money to a terrorist, at least as far as the law is concerned. You can't do that. So that's a serious sanction, right? And other things like that are going to happen. And some of them are going to be good and some of them are going to be too much, but they're going to happen. President Biden just gave a big speech where he was talking about this kind of stuff, and a portion of it was dealing with these kinds of cyber events, right? So the politicians are going to get involved, the bureaucrats are going to get involved, and they're all going to try and do stuff to make this better. And the truth is, some of it is going to make things better. Some of it's going to make things worse, as always happens with any seriously complex situation. When we try to address it with laws and regulations and nudges and collective governmental action. By the way, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do those things. We shouldn't try those things. I think everything's going to happen needs to happen. I'm just telling you, it's going to be messy. And I think a lot of people are going to start talking about criminalizing victims of ransomware, criminalizing them if they pay the ransomware. In fact, if they communicate with the ransomware operators at all. If past experience is any indication, that's all going to get a little crazy. I think there's going to be all sorts of calls for this from the political class as well as journalists and private citizens. And it's hard to say what the outcome of that is going to be. I will say that I'm not generally a fan of criminalizing victims. There's also going to be all sorts of calls for direct action against the people who are attacking our companies, against these criminal gangs. I'm certain it won't be too long before we're seriously entertaining the idea of calling in drone strikes on internet cafes. And I will share with you that I don't think turning criminal economic activity into a basis for military action is a very good idea at all. But I have no doubt that people are going to advocate it, and it may even happen. I think that cyber insurance is going to change significantly for all the reasons I talked about earlier, and it's going to change the fundamental equation about how you mitigate your risks in a company. If you're in charge of security at a company or involved with it, you may already be seeing this if you're renewing your policies for cyber insurance. And finally, I think companies are going to do their best to make all this stop. Some of them anyway, right? The top 10%, if my previous equation was correct. I think they're going to try and make it stop, or at least do enough so that the board of directors thinks they're trying to make it stop. So I'll finish off with the old joke. You can make a computer completely secure by unplugging it. And we're obviously not going to do that. We're probably going to do the opposite, actually. Things are only going to get more complex and fragile and more connected. And so I'll leave you with the closing thought. If you don't make things secure and usable, your users are going to make them usable and insecure. So that's it. That's what ransomware is, how we got here, and what's coming next. Thanks a lot for listening. I look forward to seeing you all in person next year.